Welcome. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'd like to thank you for joining today's ADHD Experts presentation titled How ADHD Affects Communication and Strategies to Improve It. One of the most under-discussed aspects of ADHD is its effect on communication. Executive function challenges and ADHD symptoms directly impact communication, often leading to confusion and misunderstandings, impulsive reactions, and other problems that can influence interactions with friends, family, colleagues, and others. In this webinar, we will review the impact of ADHD and executive function challenges on communication, as well as some practical solutions for communicating with more ease and clarity and less reactivity. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Mark Bertin. Dr. Bertin is a developmental pediatrician and author of How Children Thrive, Mindful Parenting for ADHD, Mindfulness and Self-Compassion for Teen ADHD, and the Family ADHD Solution, all of which integrate mindfulness into evidence-based pediatric care. He is a contributing author to the book Teaching Mindfulness Skills to Kids and Teens. Dr. Bertin is on faculty at New York Medical College and the Windward Teacher Training Institute, and on the advisory boards for the American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders, Common Sense Media, and Reach Out and Read. His blog is available through mindful.org, Psychology Today, and elsewhere. For more information, please visit his website, which is www.developmentaldoctor.com. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Bertin, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned in to the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you will receive about an hour after the live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 393 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the Certificate of Attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of this week's webinar is Inflow. Inflow is the #1 app to help you manage your ADHD. Developed by leading clinicians, Inflow is a science-based self-help program based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. Click the link on the screen to download Inflow or get the app now on the App Store or Google Play Store. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Bertin. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion on ADHD and communication.
Well, so thank you for all that. And thank you everyone for being here. Thanks everyone for watching the recording. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about in the ADHD world. I don't think it's spoken about frequently enough. It's actually becoming more and more a topic that I think is really important, and I've been talking about a lot just in general, just mindful communication. Doesn't really relate to today's topic, but the concept of nonviolent communication. How do you communicate skillfully without letting things escalate? You know, stick strong to what you really think needs to happen and still get communication actually happening. So today, I broke the talk up really into 3 parts. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, starting with just the impact of ADHD on communication, which if you're here, you probably already have some intuitive sense of, but I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, things to look for. The second thing I'm going to talk about is some general things that can help facilitate communication, really in many, many households, but also some specific to ADHD. And then the third thing I want to touch on is put it in the framework of mindfulness and communication, although to just reassure anybody who doesn't actually practice mindfulness, in many ways, mindfulness means clear-sighted awareness. So it's something anyone can kind of get something out of when we look at how can we look at all the different things that are impacting communication as objectively and compassionately as possible and try to facilitate strong communication from that platform. So really the fundamental starting point, I think, for any talk on ADHD probably, and I'm not going to spend all that much time on it today because many of you have probably experienced it, and we can get you to places where you get to a lot of detail on this concept of ADHD is, practically speaking, an executive function disorder, not an attention disorder. And I would just encourage anyone listening who's living with or working with ADHD, if you haven't really educated yourself on sort of a practical day-to-day understanding of executive function, that's probably very valuable for you, because I think understanding how to support somebody with ADHD almost always begins with this broader view of ADHD. ADHD isn't just the sort of symptom checklist that's in the textbooks. Executive function are basically all of our self-management skills. And one of the ways I shorthand that with families often is if you can put the word management to it, it probably relates to executive function, at least in part. You have to manage your attention, you have to manage your behavior, but you certainly have to manage information, manage projects, manage time, manage your emotions, manage and sustain your effort. All of that is related to executive function. So the beginning concept in understanding ADHD and communication is just recognizing that this is where information processing basically occurs, meaning that all the information coming in, you need to sort of pick out, you be paying attention to the right place at the right time, pick out the right information, hold it in mind for a little while, organize it, decide what's important, in real time, on the fly. And that is, a very complicated situation. And then, of course, if you have emotional difficulties, that might lead to some reactivity. And when we're reactive and stressful, we don't listen and hear so well. So you can really begin by just saying that executive function itself is integral to handling all the information coming in. And it's part of how we have to manage our worlds and manage a conversation. Just to take a half step back, because I sort of mentioned very briefly and then put aside the idea of the ADHD symptom checklist, even when you look at the basic ADHD symptom checklist, if you break out what that looks like, so for anyone not familiar with it, the diagnosis of ADHD is typically made by looking at either 9 symptoms of the hyperactive impulsive type of ADHD or 9 symptoms of more of the inattention, the more cognitive internal side of ADHD. And when you look at it that way and start pulling those symptoms out, a lot of them are skills that directly affect conversation, because what are the basic 18, the more familiar 18 symptom ADHD checklist includes overly talkative. It includes interrupting too frequently. It includes speaking impulsively. It includes getting distracted in conversation. Those are all things that clearly are going to affect conversation very directly. So part one of beginning to understand how ADHD affects communication, and I guess I should say, I was trying very hard not to get too diverted and just talking about executive function in general, because that's such a huge topic that, I think, given a talk here about executive function alone. But one really useful thumbnail in supporting someone with ADHD is really looking at the fact that even though it doesn't often feel that way, it's not intuitive necessarily to understand our behavior and cognition and emotion as something that happens on a developmental path, that in childhood, you can almost shorthand it as, what if this was a 1/3 delay in this skill set of executive function? And that is where some of the short-term answers, for ADHD come from. Because if you have a 9-year-old whose skills are more like a 6-year-old, in the short run, that's going to be a good way to sort of match where they are developmentally, to meet them where they are developmentally in any situation. We speak to 6-year-olds a little differently, and we ask things of them broken up into smaller parts. We do all these things that are a little different for a 6-year-old. We're not pandering to anybody in this way. We're going to catch them up over time. We're not going to, treat them as if they're, less capable than they are. But just like if someone has like a motor delay and is having a hard time getting up and down stairs, we're not going to expect them to get up and down stairs sooner than we do the intervention. When someone has ADHD, we have to recognize that they are struggling specifically with a skill set that's behind. Now, the second thing, which also relates to this topic, is just recognizing that to help someone with ADHD, we have to really realize that from the beginning, up to 2/3, most people quote, of people with ADHD have a co-occurring condition. And that co-occurring condition could be developmental delays, which is the topic for today. So, for example, there's a higher incidence of speech-language delays in children with ADHD. And that's something we can screen for. So some children are having communication issues based on their ADHD alone. And some, which we have to screen for, might have ADHD along with a speech-language delay. The other things often on that list are learning disorders, other mental health concerns, not really the topic for today. But many years ago, I remember going to a presentation by the brilliant person and researcher, Rosemary Tannock, who I think is retired a long time ago. And she was at a Canadian lab. And one of the things they studied was the fact that they in the lab were talking about how they can actually, I don't think this ever became a clinical reality, but in the lab, they were looking at patterns of speech that related to ADHD, that they could detect children with ADHD in the lab from their speech patterns alone. This ADHD, again, it affects how you manage any situation. So they were noting in the lab that people with ADHD often had lots of pauses in their speaking. There was, they tended, the way she described it, to have like long pause, then a really fast. I saw somebody commented, "I need to speak a little slower today, and I'm working on it. Got a lot I want to cover." But that sort of same idea of little clump thoughts, the way I was picturing it was like thoughts are sort of little, just, not coordinated, trying to come up with what to say, little pause in conversation, and then a rush of conversation. And this sort of choppy pattern of speech with lots of pauses was a very common finding in their lab, which you can easily put into the classroom and realize that somebody with ADHD could easily look like they're falling behind in class, simply because when the questions are asked in class, it takes them a little longer to formulate their answer. So on the one hand, you have the ADHD symptom of raising your hand too often in class. And on the other hand, you can get kids who are very frustrated because by the time they're ready to answer the question, the sort of classroom discussion has already moved on. And then another aspect of this sort of language processing, handling complicated situations, which again, if many of you have ADHD or live with someone with ADHD, you've probably seen, is that it can be really hard to focus. I mean, this is sort of core ADHD. It's hard to focus your attention where you need to, which means in a busy cocktail party-like situation, playground situation, it can be hard to keep your attention on the one speaker among many. You're supposed to be having the conversation right in front of you. There's several other going on nearby. And that can be a very difficult thing. And in fact, one of the ways I sometimes, just to tease a little bit of coming back around to the mindfulness discussion, mindfulness is about awareness. It doesn't fix anything on its own. And one very skillful use of mindfulness, or just being self-aware, whatever word you want to put to it, is that ability to, without blaming yourself, pause in the middle of a conversation and recognize and say to somebody, and having the confidence to say to somebody, look, there's just too much going on in the room right now. If we're going to have this conversation, I have to go outside. That's hard because it involves a lot of being comfortable with yourself in that way and not judging yourself or being afraid of someone else's judgment to just say, I can't pay attention in this situation, because that is all part of, focus and executive function to handle that skill. Now, again, I'm trying not to be distracted myself by the questions are coming through, and I'm not actually supposed to pay attention to them. They're going to be triaged and asked of me later. It seems like a couple of people may have asked a little bit about this concept of what we call pragmatic language. So pragmatic language does not have to do with ADHD specifically. When you look at language skills, there's you can, very broadly speaking, if anyone here is a speech language therapist, I apologize for this oversimplification. But very broadly speaking, the skills, there are three skills. There is the skill of, kind of broadly speaking, receptive language on the level of, do you know the words? Do you understand sentences? Do you have the content knowledge for receptive language? Expressive language, similarly, is do you have the content knowledge for expressive language? Can you have the vocabulary? Can you form sentences? And that's a very simplistic view of it, but broadly speaking, there you have those two more concrete skills. And then pragmatic language is the more intuitive side of language. It's all the unspoken language. It's reading facial expressions and social situations and initiating conversations, and situational language is part of it, meaning, an example I often give is like, if I was to see one of you in my office, we would talk differently than if I was to run into you at like a dinner party. There's just there's a difference in tone there. And that is also part of pragmatic language. So there is a type of developmental delay that is called a pragmatic communication disorder, which is that kind of, even in the best of situations, it's a specific delay in the ability to manage things, to read situations in that way. And that is also part of typically an autistic spectrum disorder. So that on the one hand, you have kids, I said before that ADHD often goes along with developmental delays. So the ADHD piece is typically, as it says in the slide, the more executive function-based side of things. And that can often look like a pragmatic delay. If you're not paying attention to the right part of conversations, or if you're distracted or impulsive and all over the place, you may be plowing over other people's social cues. You may be missing other people's social cues. But the difference would typically be that, for the most part, if you have ADHD alone, if we could get you to manage your ADHD, if we can handle all the stuff that goes along with ADHD and treat it, you should be able to read social situations. Whereas you can have both things going on, which is you have ADHD complicating your pragmatic communication because you're just missing a lot of stuff. And then you have the actual pragmatic delays that also happen. So that's the last thing I wanted to mention. So all of these, today's a very short seminar, and I wanted to just touch on that. So you really have three different things. You have ADHD directly affecting communication. You have the developmental delays that go along with communication. And then you have this kind of executive function-based level impact on ADHD and communication. Most of the time people want to focus on what to do about it. So I want to transition kind of right away to, if all of this is true of ADHD, and emotion can be part of it too, obviously. I think I touched on that briefly. Then, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to help someone with ADHD communicate better? And how are we going to communicate more skillfully when somebody we know has ADHD, or for a parent or a teacher? So I want to talk now just about something separate from, the concept of mindfulness and just ADHD in general. How are we going to support communication skills? And I do think that one of the most fundamentally, foundational level things that, we don't want to skip this step, today specifically about the communication part, is to just recognize that intervening for ADHD as a whole more comprehensively will help with communication on kind of a foundational level. So without necessarily doing anything different in how we're communicating, if we look at what are all the puzzle pieces that fit together to fully manage ADHD, they're often going to include things like cognitive behavioral therapy, fine-tuning medications. If someone has a speech language delay, or just their ADHD is significant enough that it's affecting communication, we can do various kinds of speech language interventions. And that's, really important for many kids with ADHD, and not necessarily the first thing thought of, for example, when making a school plan, is if they're having issues communicating, a speech language therapist can often help, and they probably need screening for a speech language delay. I think that goes for both language and learning disorders, is that we don't want to write everything off to ADHD in a situation where 2/3 of people also have a second condition. So we want to have a very low threshold for making sure we do the sorts of evaluations that make sure a learning disability or a language delay aren't going on. When it comes to some things that occurred, that we can do that help facilitate communications generally in homes, I think some of this has to do, one of the ways I sometimes talk about some of these ADHD interventions is they're good for all kids, except even more important when someone has ADHD. So some of what we can talk about that facilitates communication is never going to hurt. It's just that kids with ADHD might need us to emphasize them even more. So if we're worried about language and communication, I think the starting point is looking at how do you facilitate language and communication in general in children. And in this media-driven, tech-driven world, one of the most important things to remember, I sometimes use the phrase around many aspects of raising children. When we look at all the research, it's kind of like the modern science of getting back to the basics. In the end, for the most part, technology has been shown to be mostly disruptive of language in early childhood, unless except for very small, not trivial almost uses. One of my favorite, when I talk about media and children, one of my favorite things to mention is like pretty much all companies that have ever made claims about promoting child development through any tool, I don't want to name any of them here because I don't want to get in trouble, but all of these companies that have sold products and DVDs and things to promote development in early childhood, promote language in early childhood, they've actually gotten successfully sued because their claims were false. The things that in general encourage early childhood language development, the first is just lots of that kind of constant chatter adults do with children. Talk to kids a lot is an important foundational skill. So every time, the primary disruptor of that, by the way, is often screens, and this is studied. So, it's easier to put your child in front of a screen quite often, like, when you're walking, I've seen that, where they have like mounts on strollers and things for technology, and it's certainly easier. It's not that you should never take a break as a parent by using screens wisely, but the chatter with kids is one way of building language. Books are one of the most amazing. A library card is one of the most powerful things you can get a child or a family. And if you raise a child immersed in books from an early age, that's been shown to improve their academic success and improve their language. There's an amazing slide I've seen presented where the amount of vocabulary a child who's been raised immersed in books and becomes a reader is exposed to by elementary school compared to ones who are not is like 1,000 times more or something. I don't know if I have the number exactly right, but the slide goes sort of like this. And this one up here, way at the top where my hand is just off screen is like the vocabulary that a child with lots of book exposure has been exposed to. And really for children in this day and age, one of the most important ways to allow any of that to happen is to set strict enough screen limits to create the open space, create the downtime that allows children to develop a love of books. And there's no other way to do it because other screens are much easier, especially when kids have ADHD, and they'll just fill up all your time if you don't do it that way. On the communication side of things, and I imagine this, you can get the slides downloaded too. I imagine this is fairly small on many people's screens. But on the communication side of things, we really just also want to set up a family environment that facilitates communication. Not how everybody was necessarily raised, but that's part of, I think for many different types of challenges in life, we need to set up the foundational sort of atmosphere and not just focus on like, well, after months and months of not communicating, now we have to communicate. That's going to be much harder. When you have somebody with ADHD, there's often an emotional charge to the situation. I'm sure many of you who have looked into behavioral interventions for ADHD have seen all the research and the discussion on how important it is to keep things positive for kids with ADHD because they're getting corrected all the time. That's just a part of their life. So you can almost say that creating an environment that facilitates overall communication, relates directly to the type of behavioral plan you have. I really feel like quite often for kids with ADHD, overemphasizing that concept of behavioral planning built around praise and reward is vital for relationships, even if it doesn't fix the problem all on its own. I mean, it's not necessarily that positive parenting techniques are going to cover everything all on their own, but it certainly changes how you relate to them. So you want to be open to communication regularly, just as a baseline, just talking about stuff when you see the need to talk about it. Not everyone's going to want to, but you just want to be open to it. That really starts off with just listening, being around, shutting off the devices, just being around. And, not everyone responds well when you're sort of in their space and just saying, what's wrong? Let's talk. What's wrong? Let's talk. It's going to shut some people off, but presence matters. I love the quote. I don't remember where I came across it, that attention is generosity. Just giving someone our attention, even quietly, will allow them to come up on their own pace to talking about what needs to be important. And there's a sense of just prioritizing and connecting, meaning finding time to play their games, finding time to praise, finding, again, this is the behavioral side of it. There's a wonderful author and teacher named Wendy Mogul who refers to this as just putting money in the bank. There's going to be challenges in life for sure, but if you're not filling the bank, filling your family bank with positive experiences, with things, an overall tone of things are going well, then when those conflicts happen, you're going to have more to draw on. So there's this general communication side that has to do with shutting off background television, spending positive time together, valuing their strengths, working with praise and reward, and just being present, that over time will facilitate communication in a way separate from the specific stuff we're about to talk about. And then around ADHD, now we're going to start tying back to where did we start with before? Now, what are some of the things that with ADHD get in the way of communication? So some of setting up communication is realizing that if we can catch ourselves and pause, we can realize that in the middle of a crisis, no one communicates so well. And if you have someone doing something really fun, especially a child, and you really want to talk about something intense, they might not be ready to talk about something intense. So when it comes to the specifics of setting up skillful communication, we want to start with just checking in with is this a good time and place to do this? And there's several different things to start with. One is checking the environment. Like I said, a distracting environment makes it much harder to have a conversation. So you want to check in on the environment, make sure minimize the amount of distractions in the environment, and then check in on your emotional state and your child's emotional state. Because if, many people summarize the stress response nowadays as fight, flight, or freeze, meaning it's not just about action, it's also about this mental state of not thinking so clearly. You're not supposed to think things through. You're not supposed to be sort of nuanced and flexible in your thinking when you're dealing with a crisis. You're just supposed to go blank almost and just act. I always think of why they teach the doctors to use the crash cart, where you're just supposed to go through that checklist until you can think clearly again. And then set up transitions. That can often be a really useful way in helping someone deal with a challenging conversation of we got to touch base on this. I tell you what, in half an hour, let's sit down so that they can brace themselves and set themselves up for conversation. So there's a sort of background check of just, is this the time and place to get this conversation going? And then it's very important to make some adjustments specifically for ADHD, meaning that ADHD includes much what I mentioned at the beginning, difficulties with attention, which, by the way, this is a really important executive function-based piece of advice that I often start with around executive function that relates to communication, is that attention shifting is difficult with ADHD. So if you have somebody with ADHD who's really hyper-focused on doing something, and you either yell from across the house or even just speak from across the room without getting their full attention first, this is the information processing side of life. They might hear noise, they might know someone spoke, but they're not really going to register the question. They're not really going to get that. So in order to even begin a conversation that goes well, we have to understand ADHD. We have to pause often to let people gather their thoughts. We have to get kids' full attention before beginning the conversation or making requests. We want to develop a conversational style, which I hope I've gotten better into today. I hope I'm speaking at a pace people can follow, trying to cover a lot of information. But we want to keep things concise and pause a lot to make sure everything's being really, all the inputs getting in, everything's being heard. And I think a general thing that's true, again, in all aspects of life, but particularly around ADHD, where there's often been a lot of conflict and correction going on, is really try to filter from our language all the extra digs that may just trigger someone and just shut down conversation to begin with. The all I know this doesn't go, or not like last time, or look, whatever it is, all this sort of somewhat negative, maybe masked and joking, but kind of critical language that's just going to trigger someone who knows, they're kind of in trouble, or who worries they're kind of in trouble. The same thing goes during the conversation as well. And there's several things. One or two of these we're going to come back to later again, is that when we're talking to someone with ADHD, again, somebody in here said something about a child having problems with multi-step requests. Well, some of it, so that they don't feel like they're going to get talked down to, and you're not asking, them to, they don't even need to know what's going on, can be on our end, just simplifying things, not making that multi-step request in the first place, or giving a little bit of information and just leaving the rest of it for later. A really simple, for when things are really important, thing to ask for once in a while. And again, watching our own tone and language is just, can you repeat that back to me? What did you understand of what I just said? That's a useful thing to say in almost any conversation. What are you understanding about all this? Or what do you think about all this? And I'm going to end with the idea of communication repair, but I did want to touch on it earlier as well, because I think it's a vital concept to fall back on as an adult living, with ADHD. It's really, again, this comes down to just communicating skillfully in life. Communication does not always go that well. We can't expect perfection in any situation. But the concept of communication repair is recognizing that the follow-up to conversation is integrally part of the actual conversation. Recognizing that we got to give ourselves the space to say, I think I misspoke. And we got to give our kids a chance to say, like, did that, just to check, come back in and just say, did that go well for you? Is there anything you want to add? Is there anything you want to say differently? Because again, when you double the communication stuff we're talking about up against the emotional side of ADHD, clearly a lot of conversations are going to get a little off the rails, and we may never get to the point where they're going to go smoothly 100% of the time, because that's not realistic of life in general. So the idea of just normalizing and facilitating this sort of last step follow-up is a vital step to communication in any situation. And that's another piece of it we can use to help with our kids. We're going to do our best. We're going to come back to it. We'll see how it goes. We'll just follow up again and see how it goes. So that's a series of things we can do that generally help with ADHD alone. But I really wanted to put this in the context of mindfulness, just because I really enjoy normalizing the idea of mindfulness, but also because I think it's a useful model anyone can use, whether or not you particularly practice mindfulness or not. Mindfulness itself, there's all these cliches, just so you know. It doesn't mean you're going to have a quiet mind. Oh, that's actually, I realize I switched the slide order, so I'll get to that in a second, but it doesn't mean anything perfect. It's just a recognition, and I don't think that anybody would disagree with this, that life is easier dealt with if we're giving full attention to whatever's going on for a moment. If we have something fun going on, we're going to get more out of it if we're giving it our full attention instead of half worrying about a work problem or life or the state of the world. Part of resilience is the ability to give our full attention and awareness to the positives in life. And if there's a problem going on, but we're all caught up in like projecting into the future or some regret about the past, or just so shut down by fear and stress that we're not really giving it, our full best attention, that's going to undermine our lives too. So a really important reframe of mindfulness is that it's something anybody can do. It's just like anybody can hit the gym and get a little more fit. Mindfulness is a way of just building the traits that help us stay resilient and patient more often. Not perfect, but resilient and patient more often. So especially around ADHD, it's really important to recognize that nobody can be perfect, that nobody's mind is quiet all the time, with or without ADHD. No one is calm all the time, with or without ADHD. It's really more recognition that, in any situation, being aware of what's going on is going to be valuable. So we're just trying to build this trait of being more aware in any particular situation, which I think is a particularly valuable way of approaching skillful communication. And like I said, I think in the modern world, the way things are going, everything is about conflicted, non-communicative communication. There is no real communication going on in so many different situations, and that has no good end to it. So this concept of really just approaching communication in a way in which we stay strong, it's being mindful doesn't mean being a doormat. It means being skillful and non-reactive whenever possible. So there's two sort of mindfulness frameworks I'm going to give people today, and then I'll pause for the questions. One is a more general approach, which I'm going to start with, of just how can mindfulness inform communication with or without ADHD, and I'll bring in some ADHD specific items. And then really a before, during, and after communication way of approaching it, if you want to just make it a practice almost. So the starting point is just recognizing that mindfulness can facilitate communication by really being clear in our intentions going into a conversation. So in other words, catch ourselves and just check in. Are we giving full attention, or are we, who hasn't done this where we're sort of having a conversation, but really we're already having the next conversation, or really we're already dealing with we're already predicted in dealing with the fact that it's going to go wrong, or that we know the answer, or that, there's a long list of things, or that we're on our phone and having a conversation, or we're having the conversation, but we're distracted by the news, or all these different things are going on. So setting intentions is part of what we're trying to do with mindfulness. In so many situations, we have an idea of what would be the best way to approach it, but we're too caught up in all our stuff to even do what we know. So it starts with this idea, which I'm going to get into more detail, of just giving full attention to the conversation, setting the intentions of, are we really there to listen or are we there to win? Really checking in with our own intentions, and then being aware enough to know, like, can I even have this conversation now? Or am I so caught up in my anger that I can't even speak? Or am I so caught up in my belief that this person is off base that I'm not even listening to what they're saying? So that's a general approach to mindfulness in so many situations. And we can really begin, some of this exploration of how the world works is just recognizing that, nobody in any situation responds to someone getting in their face with anger and, an edge and an assumption that they're wrong with, positivity. That conversation never is going to go smoothly if that's how you approach it. Just like the old computer, dictum from years ago, like garbage in, garbage out, they used to talk about computer data. Reactivity into a conversation means reactivity out of the conversation. And there's a practice that I would typically do, I don't have time for it today, which I often do, which is, you can imagine in any situation, just take a moment, now or just after this lecture today, this talk today, to really picture a challenging conversation or common conversation you have. Picture a challenge you've had recently or one that comes up a lot. And then just imagine for yourself, if one of the people you most respected could just drop in and take your place, how would that person hold their body? What kind of language would they use? How would they choose to, both stay strong, but de-escalate the situation? Because in the end, how many people are going to, just like I said, even in a situation where you need to be strong and make something happen, from a platform of reactivity, who is going to respond to that with calm? That is going to escalate almost by nature. So communication, like many skills in life, is a practice. It's something we can identify our typical habits and then begin to see, can we begin to change them in different ways? So this kind of quick overview of a general view of mindfulness is a recognition that there's so many different parts to how we are meeting any particular moment that we can literally break into this piece of, like, there's a physical part, an emotional part, and how we're thinking. And it's very practical to look at things that way sometimes. So how can we facilitate communication through this model? Well, we can check in, first of all, in any situation with how are we carrying our bodies? How often with our kids, for example, do we think we're saying something calm, but if we check in with our bodies, we're sort of half leaning back with our arm crossed and our, sort of an expression on our face that kind of says, like, no way. And again, we've already shut the conversation down there. So there's a physical awareness to communication that we can begin with that really changes the dynamic of conversations. When we talk about mindfulness in medicine, for example, we often teach, one of the first steps is just sit down. Doesn't matter how little time you have or feel you have. Sit down, take a few breaths, make eye contact, and try to connect. So there's a physical aspect to communication that will help, if we can become aware of it, that helps facilitate communication. And then there's an emotional practice we can do. A big aspect of this sort of mindfulness approach to communication is just recognizing that in any situation, our emotions impact that situation. And if we can develop a sense of emotional awareness, that facilitates communication. So, and some of that, by the way, like I said, awareness just means acting skillfully, can be just recognizing, like, if I check in with myself right now, I can really realize that I can't even communicate right now. I've just gotten too angry to speak, and I'm going to take a breather instead of even trying. So I'm trying to be mindful of time here. So I will say there are a couple of practices you can look up. I have them online on my website. Many other people do, that help with learning to manage your emotions. And you can work with these on your own. You can work on these with kids. The RAIN practice is an acronym that works on recognizing and normalizing emotions, a key skill to emotional awareness. And there's a little in the moment breathing practice that I really think is quite useful for me. It's not going to sound like much if you've never practiced mindfulness. Most of mindfulness is about practicing things till they become familiar. But the idea of bringing intentions back to to any challenge can come down to just, even for a few breaths, a situation's coming totally unwound. You can just sort of recognize it, be honest about like, okay, everybody's really wound up here, and then make a practice of just what would you like to give back in that moment? What attitude, what perspective would you like to bring to it? And try to come back to that idea of reactivity in equals reactivity out. And then the last thing that it's valuable, in this model to pay attention to in any moment is just that, there's body and there's emotion and there's how are we thinking about this situation? Are we just aiming to tell them what we believe already, or have we already projected and decided what people are going to say? Or are we listening? Or are we giving them the opportunity to change or say something different? Are our thoughts mostly in the past, like finishing this conversation and dealing with it, and even though it hasn't happened yet, or in the future, that would be, or in the past, where we're caught up in just, anger of what happened this morning? Are we spending all our time planning what we're going to say next instead of actually listening to what the other person is saying? Are we just caught up in just making up stories about the situation, to try to, put it in context before it's even happened? And these are all thought patterns that can undermine communication. And one thing to say as I talk about this, if it's sort of, I know this might be a different approach, and if anyone's sort of tapping out, listening to it, is we can always remember that just this idea of like setting our best intentions regularly, trying to communicate in this way in any situation is impossible to be perfect. But as this brilliant teacher of mindfulness said recently in a talk I went to, it's impossible. Communication is really hard. People get in your face. It's really difficult. And who even sets the intention of trying to do this, of trying to stay strong while de-escalating any situation? Who really is trying? Because if everyone tried, that would make a huge difference in life. So there's a lot of value to just coming back to that intention. So for the last few slides, I just want to reframe that mindfulness into one of my, I think a very practical way to approach communication, which is to say that knowing everything we do about ADHD now, how can we set things up for success? And you can look at it as before, during, and after communication. And then I'll go through this relatively quickly and pause for questions. As I noted when I was talking about ADHD in general, one of the most important things to do if there's an important communication about to happen is check in. It's about awareness before the discussion happens. In terms of physically, is the situation a good place to do it? Am I really intent on discovering someone's motivation? For any of you who are working with teens in particular, this also goes for healthcare providers, change happens when you can connect with someone else's point of view and motivation. If you don't connect with their motivation and where they're coming from, they're very unlikely to take your advice or listen very well. So we set up for success by just checking in, making sure we're ready to listen, making sure we've sort of know what our beliefs are. Beliefs are good, but maybe they've crossed over to putting someone in a box, and really just check in with ourselves going into any conversation in this way. And then we want to sustain that level of awareness throughout the conversation. For example, if our facial expression, how we're carrying our body, or our emotions start getting in the way, we want to be able to be aware of that so we can readjust and try to create, carry ourselves in a way that's going to let someone else feel comfortable enough to communicate. And then during conversation, this is one of those things that's good for all conversation and really, really important if you're working with someone with ADHD. Try to listen first. It doesn't mean, obviously in some situations it's important to speak first. There's no absolutes here. See if you can listen first. One of my favorite skills to develop in conversation to talk about is in any situation, try to find a place we agree. We both want you to be happy. That may be all it is. You may agree about nothing else functionally, but try to agree first. Or if someone says a long list of things and there's a real problem in it, but some of it was actually made kind of sense, make sure you reflect back the fact that I agree with you about this and this. That's a major, major thing to do during conversation that allows conversations to stay connected. Active listening is an idea you may have heard of, which really means setting aside our own, not judgment in the terms of having sound judgment, but judging from the terms of judging others. Try to listen first, understand their motivation, try to prompt before you give advice. People don't generally want unsolicited advice. And then the idea of collaborative problem solving, which is different in younger kids. It doesn't necessarily work exactly in younger kids. They have a planning disorder if they have ADHD. But certainly with teens, the goal is to try to do it in a more collaborative way. We know the boundaries of what's appropriate, but within those boundaries, we're going to try to understand their motivation and through a discussion, come up with a real serious solution. And just continually ask open-ended questions. Try to truly get someone talking and understanding what they believe through kind of open-ended questions that really try to seek out what's going on in their heads. So just one or two last slides, and then I'll pause. Through all of this, we can check in with sort of the perspective we're taking, the language we're using. Keep things factual. Try to cut back on the hyperbole. Don't blame, to avoid blame. You can only know what's going on in someone's head, through what they tell us. So try to reflect back what they're saying and focus on our own experience. That's the concept of using I, not you statements as often as possible. And again, I guess I put the concept of avoiding unwanted advice on 2 different slides. And then, that concept of just reflecting back as often as possible to establish the fact that I'm here, I really am hearing you. The phrase I'm hearing you, that can almost be a little dismissive. But if we can actually reflect back the content, that can be really helpful. So the last couple of things to end with are kind of I wanted to mention conflict, and then I wanted to mention communication repair, and then I'll pause for questions. One of the things to just recognize is none of this is meant to be passive. I think there's often a fear that if I practice mindfulness or I let someone else talk first, I'm going to become a doormat. There is definitely a time from my perspective to take a stand in life. One of the ways I heard this phrase recently, which I loved, was if it's time to pick up a sword, do so with regret. So if it's time for conflict, like, your teenager just cannot, do X anymore. We're going to set a rule here. It's about self-awareness, navigating it as skillfully as possible with as little escalation as possible, and try to keep your own, anger and malice out of it, not malice, anger and reactivity out of it as much as possible, because, that's the only thing you can control. And one thing I think that's always valuable about ADHD is just recognize that often people get blamed for their ADHD symptoms when they're just an ADHD symptom, which doesn't make them easy to manage, but it does explain them better than you're just not listening, or you're just being difficult. And when you take the judgment out of it in that way, it can change how you relate to a challenge. And then in ending, like I said, that really a lot of what I went over today isn't going to change all that quickly necessarily. All these different things, they either require ADHD interventions or speech language therapy, or changing really fixed habits in how you communicate or your family communicates or how your child communicates. It doesn't all change at once, but we can focus on the fact that communication repair is always okay. You can just notice the point where we're no longer communicating and say, all right, let's pause. We'll get back to this later. And make sure you're allowing other people to do the same as often as possible. And that's how we can often facilitate strong communication over time. So speaking of communication, thank you for listening for all this time. Just to very briefly summarize and then start taking questions, it's really important to acknowledge that ADHD directly impacts communication quite frequently. I don't want to overlook the fact that more comprehensively addressing ADHD often facilitates communication a lot all on its own. So you don't want to skip that step. But if we can really see with unbiased awareness the impact of ADHD on communication, all of these things we touched on today can begin to facilitate better communication with anybody with or without ADHD. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today, for listening to the video, if that's what you're doing. And I think I'll pause there and we'll take questions for a few minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bertin. That gave us a lot to think about. I will launch right into questions. Briefly, I would just want to, again, thank our sponsor for today's webinar, Inflow. And I will say that as the questions come in, I'm seeing themes that align very directly with the beginning of your presentation about executive functions. Mm-hmm. And many of the challenges are directly related to those. So the first in this series is working memory. This coming more from adults who say that they have challenges in conversation. They feel they are going to lose the thread or forget what they want to say, and they end up impulsively blurting out or sort of hijacking the conversation. And they're aware that they're doing it. They feel they need some strategies to hold their thoughts better internally and not blurt out. Can you offer any advice for them?
Well, I mean, I think we're talking about two or three different things there that come to mind. I mean, certainly some of it, a little bit of that actually relates directly to ADHD symptoms, it sounds to me a little, in that, there's a little bit of a flavor. Some of that is impulsivity sometimes, some of that is impatience. And again, those are ADHD symptoms. So in terms of sort of the framework we went through today, that's a piece of that does relate to me to just making sure your ADHD is being treated as thoroughly as possible, because it's kind of like putting your glasses on. And it doesn't mean medication necessarily, although that's a piece of it for many people. But the point is that if you want to approach conversation with as much ease as possible, if your ADHD itself is more thoroughly treated, that might take the edge off of some of the kind of ADHD symptomatology that affects what you're saying. Now, the working memory is also part of ADHD too, as for anyone who's not familiar with it, that's kind of like the information management part of executive function, holding things in mind. And I think one of the more practical things can often be, especially, a lot of the more important communication we do has to be with people we're familiar with. We're involved with, in conversations regularly. And I think a second thing you can do is for people you're talking with often, just let them know you need those pauses, and let maybe, if it's somebody within your family, you might even set up, like a little signal of like, hold on, something neutral to say like, wait, gathering my thoughts here. And that can take the pressure off too. In some situations, another thing you might do is, where it's more like maybe a meeting, is take some notes, so write down your thoughts so that I was even doing that a little bit while I was giving this talk of just like, oh, wait, got to come back to that. So that's a third thing you can do, is sort of take some notes so that you can be confident, like, okay, this is going to happen here. And maybe the fourth one does a little bit have to do with a kind of a broad interpretation of the idea of communication repair. Was if you can even just make yourself a one-word note and just recognize that if it's important, you might want to find time right after the conversation to come back to it. So, so I don't know. I hope that's helpful, but those are some of the thoughts I would have about managing that.
Yes, very helpful. And absolutely right that impulsivity is a big part of that, and obviously a neurological component of ADHD. And we did receive a number of questions specifically about impulsivity and more for children, specifically children who may blurt out hurtful things to siblings and to parents who apologize but fall into this habit of doing it again. How can parents approach that challenge with empathy, but also consequences?
I think to some degree, you've answered the question there, in that I think for any behavioral challenge with ADHD, we have to approach it with both empathy and clear consequences. And I think, so for children doing that, I do think it's quite important to start from the perspective of like, it's just their ADHD. Like, probably there's nothing more going on there. There's nothing malicious. It's just not in a minimalist way, but just in kind of like only it's ADHD. So it's not their fault exactly, but they're going to learn from consequences. So I think, there's really three, in terms of like what interventions are going to help with that, I think there's three things we can think of. And the first one has to do with something I alluded to during the talk, which is just that this is the heart and soul of why even generally well-behaved kids with ADHD often benefit when their parents have really structured behavioral plans in place they're falling back on. Because some of that relates to that idea of like pulling money from the bank that I talked about. Like, we're going to focus on positive time together and praise and reward systems and all these things that set a general tone of connectedness and working towards goals together and positive experience, because that is a problem we got to work on. So that when they get corrected in that moment, it's against this backdrop of mostly things going well. So part one is the behavioral approach to that. And the message can often be like, I recognize you're impulsive, but that one thing we're going to work on, you can't say those things. You're in timeout if you say those things to your brother. And the communication of doing it in a neutral way has a lot to do with how we approach it. Timeouts can be very dispassionate. Like, if you do that to your brother, you're in timeout. And all of this has to do with the hard work of, I'm not minimizing how hard it is, of creating a really structured, useful behavioral plan. So the behavioral piece is one. And then the second piece is that, what the medications do well around ADHD tend to be like our old view of ADHD, anything related to focus, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. So a second piece to remember is that if someone is chronically impulsive and has ADHD, it may be that their medication needs adjusting, because, it may be that they can't control their impulses and it really is truly out of their control. And that's a second part of it. So the behavioral piece is a big one. That also can be working with their own cognitive psychologist on it. That's a evidence-based behavioral intervention is, cognitive behavioral therapy helps with these sorts of things. The second thing is, our behavioral, how we are approaching it through a really structured behavioral plan. And then just to continue with the sort of framework for today, there was a study just within the last couple of years working with mindfulness in children down to age 7 with ADHD on the emotional impulsivity or the emotional reactivity, with some success. So again, the premise of mindfulness is like stuff happens, emotions happen, all these things happen, and we can, through repetitive training, build our ability to be less reactive to them. That's one of the premises of mindfulness. So those are 3 things you can do to work with that, I think.
Wonderful. And yes, you touched on another big theme here, which is parents with ADHD, parenting children with ADHD, and how an impulsive reaction from a child may trigger an impulsive reaction from a parent, and you end up in a downward spiral of kind of emotional dysregulation. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I assume this is where mindfulness really becomes key.
It does in many. I mean, the reason I started teaching mindfulness I was practicing it long before I started using it in medicine. And the reason I started introducing it in medicine, separate from the science that was developing, is it just felt like parents were just way under supported in all of this. This is really demanding stuff, really stressful. And just like anything else in life, if we can get our own feet on the ground, if we can feel more, patient and able to deal with anything, that's going to help us manage ADHD. And that totally goes for this communication. It's that idea, like I said before, reactivity in equals reactivity out. Although I would broaden it a little bit, because in adult ADHD, there's nothing you could say about treating pediatric ADHD as any different than adult ADHD, and it's not always approached that way. So just like you could break up, like, how do you work with a child's impulsiveness and conversation into behavioral interventions, medical interventions, and mindfulness, the same thing goes for parents, and it may be some, I often think about ADHD care as like putting puzzle pieces together until you happen to have the whole puzzle filled up. It's going to be different for everybody. But adult ADHD is the same. Like some combination of those 3 things might get you, better complete coverage, so you can then start working on your communication skills more easily.
Right. And I would assume that similarly, we have a number of spouses here who are looking to improve their communication. So spouses without ADHD, as well as those with, and the ones without are looking for strategies to less nagging, more real communication.
Right.
And also another theme is that emotional reactivity, especially as you mentioned, when your spouse with ADHD is perhaps hyper-focusing on something or transitioning from one task to another, that's a real problem area. And spouses are looking for some ideas on how to better navigate those waters.
That's a huge stress in many relationships. And I think, the easiest way to think about it, again, I think the easiest way to think about it in part, just to cover a lot of information concisely, is that same idea that, in any situation, the same framework is generally hold true of, in any relationship, you need to focus on, John Gottman's research, for example, shows that in marriages, a healthy marriage has about a 3 to 5 to 1 ratio of positive feedback to corrective feedback, or positive to negative. So the same thing would go for spouses, is that you want to try to create a general tone as much as you can of having a foundation of connection, foundation of positive experience. That often takes some effort when family life gets really busy. Setting aside a time for that is really important. So there's the foundational part of just general relationship. And then I think there's the understanding ADHD part of it. So just like I talked about it mostly in the context today of, working with children, the same thing goes with working for adults. How do I set up the environment so it's more easily? How do I get someone's full attention, give them lots of pauses to respond? The same thing goes in a marriage as it would in, as it would in working with children. And then the really big one too is to allow for communication repair. And it's really hard. I mean, I know I'm someone who's very sensitive to reactivity. I don't really love it there's plenty of it in my house, like every other household. And part of it is like trying to just not, just like catch yourself, step away if it's getting to you too much, and but really go out of the way to allow for the reconnection later, when things have settled down. So I think that's how I would look at it.
Wonderful. Dr. Bertin, we are unfortunately running short on time. I did just want to mention before we wrap up quite a few questions about resources for teaching mindfulness to children and teens. So I will just remind our listeners, first of all, that you have a whole library of books on this topic, and specifically some for teens, which seems to be a big stumbling block. Right. Are there any other resources that you would quickly recommend for our listeners?
I mean, the quickest thing to know is I have a mindfulness page on my website, which has a lot of these resources on there. And I also have some meditation for kids up in various places. I think some are on my website, some are on the Insight meditation timer. The core concept with kids, I think, is one called planting seeds, which is like, you can't force someone to, do intensive mindfulness practice really young necessarily. You're just trying to familiarize them with it, typically through practicing yourself. Most of us who work with younger kids and families really recommend parents practice it themselves first, because you can't force anyone else to practice it. So just get started with your own practice first. You'll familiarize yourself. Then you'll know, you'll sort of get a sense of what would make sense to my child. And then in terms of specific books and programs and things like that, I have a list on my website, and that might just be the easiest thing to refer people back to.
Wonderful. So to those listening, we will provide links to all of those resources in the wrap up to this webinar. And so be on the lookout for that for follow-ups. And for now, we just really would like to thank everyone for joining us here today for this conversation, and to Dr. Bertin for leading this webinar and for giving us so much useful advice and perspective on the communication challenges associated with ADHD. We hope that you will join us next week. We actually have a webinar on a related topic, and that's supporting children with ADHD and sensory processing disorder. And that's with occupational therapist Candace Peterson. So a few people here asked about sensory processing, how that impacts communication. We hope you will join us for that, and join us at ADDitudeMag.com always. So thank you so much, everyone. We hope you have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Bertin.
Oh, thank you. It's great being here. Take care.